Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich talks with community leaders about issues in the public safety arena. Sponsored by River Ridge Hardware.
This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. We're hoping you're having a good day. Today in studio with me, I have a special guest, the Spokane County Regional Health Doctor, Public Health Doctor, Frank Velazquez. And we're going to talk a little bit about a topic that really seems to be controversial at times. It's a topic that you hear in the news all the time, and that's vaccinations. And there's a lot of controversy around, it seems, the nature of the vaccines, the speed at which the vaccines were brought forward. Pretty much unprecedented when you really think about it, what they were able to do and accomplish in such a short amount of time. And in reference to that, can you give us an idea of exactly what it took to get us to the point where we actually had the vaccine? And, how did that happen so quickly?
Well, first of all, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. And as you pointed out, it's unprecedented, and there's three reasons why we were able to bring vaccines to the market so quickly. First is the technology that is being used, either mRNA or the virus vector technology. Are technologies that have been around since the 70s, used very broadly since the 90s in vaccines for infectious diseases, cancer, and a number of other areas. So we did have a lot of experience with that particular technology. Second, we have never seen the amount of resources that have been put towards this effort in the history of medicine in the country or in the world, actually. In addition, there was such a collaboration between companies and academic healthcare systems, et cetera, that we haven't seen before. If you think about the vaccines, these are all a partnership. Each one of them is more than one company working together. And then lastly, we were able to do all three phases to get to the emergency use authorization in sequence without any gaps in between, which is something that is very difficult to do, and we typically have not been able to do that well before. So that is the reason why they move as quickly as they did, but no stage in the clinical trials process was not followed. We followed every single stage, thousands and thousands of patients to get to where we are today, and that's why we did it so quickly.
A lot of people talk about the safety of the vaccine. How safe is it? And a lot of times, depending on where you're on the spectrum of how you feel about the vaccine, how could it be safe, because it did go through such a very quick process. But the one thing I keep coming back to, and I've done a lot of reading on this topic, doing a lot of research, was the amount of people that were actually vaccinated and the amount of research that went into each and every time the vaccine was given. Did that have a very positive effect on our ability to make sure that the vaccine is safe?
That's a good point, and the answer is yes. The amount of people that were used in the clinical trials and the follow-up of each one of those gave us a good idea of what the side effects could be. And by the way, every medication, whether it's a vaccine or a therapeutic drug, is bound to have some side effects. And we have seen some. For the most part, they're minor. They're typically pain in the injection site. You may feel a little bit like you're fighting a cold. You may have a little bit of a spike of fever. And if you're younger, you tend to react a little bit more strongly than if you're a little bit older. But for the most part, the side effects that we have seen are minimal. And any other side effects that have been associated, at least with the timing of the vaccine, that may be a little bit more complex, like the myocarditis, for example, are in such low frequency that is a temporal relationship as opposed to a direct relationship. And we have seen that with pretty much any other vaccine. If you think about it, 2-3 years ago, we also had an alert about the flu vaccine and potential association with myocarditis. The issue with myocarditis specifically, and I bring it up now because that's one of the areas people worry about, is we see thousands of cases every year. We don't know exactly why, typically following a viral infection or something along those lines. Younger people, mostly males between 12 and 29, 12 and 20, which is what we see in the cases that have been reported. But if you think about it, is about 1,000 cases out of 270 million doses or something along those lines. So it's a very, very, very small number of potential side effects that we still have a temporal relationship with, but we don't know if the vaccine caused it.
You mentioned that having a virus, getting the virus, can have the same effects on the heart. Early in the pandemic, you were seeing some of that effect. People that got COVID also developed swelling in the heart or lining of the heart. So how do you distinguish if it was already happening due to the infection? How do you distinguish that it wasn't the infection that caused the heart issue versus the vaccine? On, let's say me, I got COVID first, then had the vaccine 90 days later because they said you couldn't have the vaccine for 90 days. If I developed any heart issues, it'd be very hard to distinguish which came first, wouldn't it?
Well, that's a very good point, and let me just mention something. Earlier in the pandemic, we did say you have to wait 90 days, and the reason for that was supply, for the most part. Now you can actually get the vaccine as long as you're asymptomatic, usually 10 to 14 days after being exposed and having the disease. As long as you don't have a fever and you're asymptomatic, you can get your vaccine. And I say that because people don't have to wait the 90 days. They should talk to their doctor. The point that you made is very important. We had seen a number of cases of myocarditis in people with the disease, with COVID itself. We've seen some myocarditis temporally related to the vaccine, usually after the second dose. But it's really hard to tell whether it's related to that or something else. As you pointed out, if you had disease and then you get vaccinated and you have myocarditis, we wouldn't be able to tell which one caused it. That's why I say is a temporal relationship. You try to make a relationship with whatever happened within a period of time that will result in the clinical symptoms of myocarditis. But the reality of the matter is we saw more patients with myocarditis that had COVID than we have seen patients with myocarditis that may be related to the vaccine.
Let's take my case again, having COVID, then getting the vaccine. There's arguments, pros and cons to that. There's arguments, pros and cons to somebody that had COVID getting the vaccine. A lot of people, again, depending on where you fall on the vaccine, say we never give people that have had the disease the vaccine because it can weaken their natural immunity. I hear that argument all the time. I hear that argument in the media. I hear that argument when I'm talking to people about the issue. How do you deal with that type of argument of, I had COVID, I shouldn't have got the shot?
Sure. That's a good point, because I hear that a lot, and there's a lot of confusion. So first of all, if you think about other diseases, any other disease, the flu, the fact that you have the flu doesn't mean that you can't get it again. So we do know that with COVID, there's a certain level of immunity. We don't know how long it lasts. We've seen studies from 3 months to 9 months, 6 months, and everything in between. We do know a number of things. First of all, we know that a certain percentage of people do not develop an immune response that is consistent with an infection. And that is between 4 and 9 or 10% of the people. That's number one. Number two, if you had infection with a particular strain, that doesn't mean that you will have antibodies that may be protective against a different strain. And as you know, we've had multiple strains of this virus. Then third, we do know that in patients that had disease, the cellular component of the immune system, the T cells, you don't see the response in all of the patients that you typically see in an infection. You see the opposite, actually. In some patients, it's decreased as opposed to increased, which tells us that it's an erratic immune response. We do know that if you have disease and you get the vaccine, you actually generate more antibodies than if you just take the vaccine alone, which is a good reason to do it. And lastly, we do know that the vaccine-generated antibodies are effective against all the strains that are currently around the world.
So when you mentioned the strains currently around the world right now, Delta is currently
Sure.
the one that's affecting us right now. In many countries, Delta had an extreme effect on India. A lot of people got sick. A lot of people died in India due to Delta. Could that be because India wasn't as strongly vaccinated as, let's say, Israel? Because you see people getting Delta in Israel, but you don't see the deaths and the hospitalizations that, let's say, India saw.
That's a good point. So when you look at the first isolation of the Delta variant, which was December 2020, but goes back to October, at that point, India had about a 3% immunization rate, typically in the larger cities. So as this spread through the country, it was actually able to spread in an unvaccinated population. And if you think about it, if you look at the most recent studies, vaccinated versus not vaccinated, as a general rule, like in the States, for example, you are about 5 times more likely to get infected with Delta if you're not vaccinated as compared as if you are. You're also 29 times more likely to end up in the hospital if you're unvaccinated as compared to if you're vaccinated. And those that end up in the hospital, if you have been vaccinated, the average age is 65 and over. And we do know that these were the folks that were increased risk because of age and comorbidity, so they already had a risk. The average age for those that are unvaccinated is 49. And if you look at the patients in Spokane, they're in the 50s. And between 95 and 98% of the patients in the hospital with COVID right now, typically Delta variant, are people that are unvaccinated or incompletely vaccinated, meaning they got 1 dose out of 2 and they stop. So I think that makes a point that the reason why it was able to spread so quickly and cause so much morbidity and mortality in India is because it was a largely unvaccinated population. You mentioned Israel, which is one of the countries that achieved the highest rate of immunization earlier in the pandemic. And you have seen the Delta spread, but not cause the morbidity and mortality. And we're seeing the same thing here. Those patients that are sicker, and the patients that are in the ICU, and the patients that are not doing as well, unfortunately, are typically those that are not vaccinated.
And the difference is fairly appreciable because looking at the data out of Israel and the graphs, you can see that early on in the pandemic, they kind of like everybody else had that large spike. But after the mass vaccination, in the cycle of Delta, let's say, that hospitalization and death rate was very much lower than early on in the pandemic for Israel. Why 2 shots versus 1 shot on Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer only 1?
Actually, Pfizer, Moderna 2, Johnson & Johnson 1. So, and Israel actually did most of the studies. They started doing booster shots probably a couple of months ago and have done between 1 and 2 million, and their population is about 9. They have about 7 million immunized, so that's a very high level of immunization. But the reason is because, like with any other vaccine, you have to find the right dosage. And it seems that the immunity conferred by the vaccines, those wane a little bit over a long period of time, which is typical of vaccines. And that 3rd dose generates an equivalent initial response as good as when you had your 2 doses. So more than likely, this is going to end up like any other vaccine, where you may need a booster shot at defined periods of time as it goes from the pandemic to being endemic, like the flu. And I'm not trying to compare with the flu. Obviously, this is a lot more severe. But I'm just saying in terms of the natural progression of the virus. And we saw that in Israel, we saw that in other parts of the world, like UK and Germany and Spain. That's why in many parts of the country, parts of the world, they were calling it the disease of the young, because a lot of the younger people were not vaccinated. And we have seen, if you look at Spokane, for example, more than half of all our cases are under 29 or 30, they're in the 30s at best. That's more than half of our cases, which is a lot.
The way I tried to explain to people about, 2 shots for some of the manufacturers, one for another, booster shots. When you take a look at the shingles vaccine, that's a 2-shot system also.
Right.
I had a shot and had to wait X amount of time to come back to get the second. It's not unheard of for this type of series for a particular virus. Hepatitis B is another
Correct.
multi-series shot. So it's not that it's out of the realm for this to happen, and you mentioned it several times. People don't like to compare COVID with the flu, but the flu is a disease just like COVID. Every year we get a different change in the flu vaccine. Do you see the possibility that this COVID is going to be treated like the flu down the road, that there will be a yearly shot for COVID at the rate it's going? Because we have 2 variants coming up that, the Lambda and the MU variant, which is in 39 countries right now. Do you see us having to change the vaccine over time to meet the new variants? Because MU variant seems to be able to bypass both natural and the vaccine immunity.
So that's let's talk about that a little bit, because viruses do mutate all the time. That's very typical. That's why we have different flu vaccines every year. They're tailor-made for whatever the predominant strains are at that particular time of the year. And vaccine manufacturers are very good at doing that. They've been doing it for many years with many vaccines. But you have to take a step back and think about SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, is a brand new virus to all of us. We knew very little about it 20 months ago. Now we know a lot more. So one of the things that you do when you develop a vaccine is look for what is called the correlate of protection. Like, what is the level that you need to generate of antibodies with what dose to have protective effect against the variants that are in the environment. And that is the reason why we're looking at now these 3 doses potentially. And the issue is going to be, because if you look around the world, we've had about 4,000 variants. Of those, about 15 to 20 have been of more concern because of their mutations. But it is conceivable that we will need to keep tracking these variants, and the vaccines may need to be modified slightly to confer the appropriate protection against whichever variants become predominant. And as the virus continues to mutate, we can foresee this virus being around for quite some time.
The SARS virus of a few years ago, COVID is very akin to SARS. And what do you think made COVID spread much more broad than SARS? Because they seem to be very similar, and we didn't take the same precautions with the previous outbreaks of SARS. Was it just the virulent strain of the COVID virus itself?
Well, if you look at it, SARS and MERS, they both had some geographical distribution. It wasn't global. And when it did go SARS more global, it didn't cause the level of disease that we saw with the SARS-CoV-2. And the reason for that is this virus mutates a little bit faster, and is actually very good at developing protective mutations that allow it to hide from either antibodies, natural immunity, and eventually vaccines, as we're seeing with some of the newer strains that have mutated inside countries in which vaccines were already available. So the virus, I don't want to say learns, because it's not a live organism, but is genetic material that mutates according to what the environment is. And this one has been particularly good at mutating and developing a protective effect. So viruses mutate and either doesn't do anything, like we saw with some of the SARS and MERS, it just stayed in a particular part of the world. It burns the virus out, meaning it's detrimental to the virus, or it develops a mutation that allows it to move through populations very quickly, which is a characteristic of this virus compared to the other ones we have seen.
When you're looking at trying to convince people that getting the vaccine is the safe protocol, one of the things I hear often is, well, we don't know the long-term effects of the vaccine, which is true. We don't. It's a fairly new vaccine, but having somebody that's been vaccinated, I made that choice, and I've talked to a lot of people about, they're very dead set against getting it because it is so new. It was done so quickly. FDA approval is starting to happen, but even now, when you mention the FDA is starting to approve it, they go, well, it usually takes 5 years. Well, I'm not sure. The one thing when I was making my decision was, the other side of that is, we don't know the long-term effects of COVID either. And there are some people that we call them long haulers that have had very severe reactions to COVID, and they're fairly very long lasting. How do you, when you're trying to talk to people about the vaccine, and that question is brought up, how do I know the long-term effects? How do you overcome that? And could you also talk about some of the long-term effects of, well, if you get COVID, here's what you could be facing?
Sure, and I think if you think about it, and I'm vaccinated too, but before I did that, I did research. I read the literature, I look at the studies, because I'm a scientist, so I look at the data first and then make a decision. And before I recommend it to my family and friends, I did my own research before I got it myself. And the reality of the matter is that the vaccine has not been around for us to know what long-term. Long-term is usually 5, 10, 20 years. So obviously it hasn't been around that long. But we do know the technologies that are behind it really well. And if you think about it, the activity of the vaccine occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, never touches the nucleus, doesn't get even near where your genetic material. So one of the concerns people say, well, it's going to alter my genes. Well, it's not going to, it doesn't get near the nucleus. So it's not going to change your genetic material. It's basically a messenger that goes in and tells the cell, make this protein up so that your immune system can attack it. That's the long and short of it. Now, could there be long-term effects that we don't know about? It could be, but given what we know of vaccines and technology, it's less likely. We do know that we are seeing patients that had COVID that continue to have a myriad of symptoms, and by now, there are about 1,000 different symptoms that have been described in people that have this long COVID, who can't really get back to normal life for months and months and months at a time. So we do know that viruses can have long-term sequelae. We've seen that with many other viruses, that years later you end up with a cardiomyopathy, or you may end up with something else. So we do know that infectious agents can do that by themselves, and the side effects could be really detrimental to the individual, particularly if you're one of these people that doesn't bounce back. Now, we're seeing, example, pregnant women with COVID is a very severe disease for many of them. We do know that fetus and baby through breastfeeding are protected if the mother is vaccinated, which is one of the things that I talk about. But at the end of the day, we do know that the only way to protect yourself from this virus, any other variants that are floating around right now, each one seems to be more virulent than the previous one. is getting your vaccine. And I encourage everyone to do that and think about the fact that we've been doing vaccines for decades. It's not a new therapy. These are not new technologies. So we do know enough to have a certain level of confidence in the long-term safety and efficacy of this.
I wanted to step back just a little bit.
Sure.
Pregnancy, because that's one of the things that you hear often about why not to. But everything that I've read, they recommend that you take that precaution, because, as you said, COVID and pregnancy is very hard on both the baby and the mother. One of the other things I've heard is, well, I understand that one of the side effects of getting the shot is sterility, and I was like, I've never read anything like that. Every ounce of the literature I've read on it says very much counter to that. There is no such thing as that that they've seen. Could you talk about that aspect
Sure.
of it also? Because I think it's important that people understand that you know, you've done a lot of research on this. Because of my position and my involvement with this disease and the response to it, I've had to do a lot of reading and a lot of research myself, and I just cannot. There's so many myths out there. We couldn't debunk them in the time we have together. But let's talk about that one, because that seems to be a fairly big one right now. Is I don't want to get the shot because I understand it could make me sterile.
Sure. And so there's three pieces there. One is a male and female infertility. So there's no data or science behind the theory that it causes infertility in either males or females. There's a second component to that, which is some people have reported abnormal menstrual cycles, but we don't know if that's just because they had an abnormal menstrual cycle related to something else or the vaccine itself. It's one of those correlations that we don't have direct evidence that one is caused by the other. And the reality of the matter is, and I come from a family of OBGYNs, so I've been hearing about abnormal menstrual cycles since I was a little kid, and there's a lot of reasons for it. Then lastly, in terms of pregnancy, there was one report that was incorrect and has been proven incorrect, that there was a potential cross-reaction with one of the components of the placenta, which is not true. What we do know is that if you're pregnant and you have the vaccine, you will have a protective effect on that fetus, and then if you breastfeed, you will transfer antibodies that are protective to the newborn. And although children under the age of 1 have a lower risk, it's still, like any other disease, any protective effect that can come from breastfeeding, I think is wonderful. And the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology has been recommending vaccines for 40 years. Like everything else, if you're pregnant, talk to your doctor, talk to your provider, and make sure that there's no other reason for you to either time it differently or space it differently. But other than that, I think it's been recommended and it has been shown to be very effective.
You know, Frank, one of the things you and I have talked about is that the fact that this pandemic was used as a political football has made it much more difficult for people like you, like me, to manage this, because it has widely divided the nation. There's extremes on both sides that are taking positions, and these extremes make it much more difficult to do our jobs and to get the proper information out. Because it's been politicized so much, people don't believe anything anymore. People don't listen to, you know, the science, if you will. They don't listen to the experts. How do we overcome that? And I'll leave that with you. We need to wrap up about 2 minutes, but how do we overcome that aspect? Because we need people to understand that this is a very serious disease, because there's people out there, oh, it's not serious at all. I've watched many of my friends die. I've watched husband and wife teams die, multiple pairs now. My daughter almost died. She was almost put on a ventilator. I've seen the negative effects of this disease. how do we convince people to protect themselves when we've done such a horrible job of destroying the credibility of almost everybody out there that should speak to this issue?
Well, that's a good point. And so you have to think about, put this into context. This is the first time, at least in my lifetime, where I have seen a disease that causes the same level of health, mental health, and economic impact. We've never seen that before. And when you have that combination, you create a natural tension between people. And unfortunately, some have taken that and interpreted it as is either right or wrong, and that is kind of like an irrelevant conversation, I do believe. What we do have a highly effective infectious agent for which we have therapies and vaccines. We do know how to manage, notice I didn't say control because it's hard to control, but manage this pandemic. We do know how to treat people. We do know how to prevent the disease. And I think we need to just move everything else out of the way as background noise. And I hear a lot, well, earlier in the pandemic, they say that it will be this long. We're learning. I don't think we've ever learned so much so quickly. If you just look at the amount of literature generated in the last 20 months, it's probably more literature that has been generated in the last 10 years on anything else, because we're learning as quickly as we can. And why is that? Because we haven't seen a virus that is as effective at mutating and transmission as this one, at least in my professional career. And I started my career with HIV way back when. I've been through H1N1 and SARS and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the reality of the matter is that we have an infectious agent that is very capable, and you have to treat it with the respect and the concern that it deserves, but we do have the tools to manage that. So when I hear people say, well, this is true and this is not true, the absolute certainty that everyone is looking for is almost impossible to get, because we're learning about a new agent, that we knew nothing about 20 months ago. So you have to put that thing into context. And my grandma used to say, and I'm going to end up with this, extremes are never good. You have to find that commonality of purpose. And I think as a community, that's what we need to do, find that commonality of purpose. And I've been talking to a lot of people that had concerns or questions about the vaccines. I'm not trying to convince them. I think people need to make their decision. I try to provide them as much information, answer as many questions as I have. And at the end of the day, if you take all the other background noise, people say, that kind of makes sense. I think I'm going to get my vaccine. And I've heard from many that say, hey, I got my shot. And I said, well, I'm glad to hear that. And I'm glad to hear that you decided to protect yourself, those around you, and help the community keep moving forward, which is the best way to do it, is by getting your vaccine.
Thank you for coming on today. Tough topic, but I think it's important that people understand that, like you said, everybody's still learning about this. It is a very serious disease, and that's one of the myths that I really want to try to get people to think about. If it wasn't this serious, we would not have spent this much money trying to combat it. If it wasn't this serious, we wouldn't be 18 months into this now, approaching 24 months very quickly, and we're still watching people die. Mm-hmm. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff Report. Have a great day.
This is River Ridge Frame Shop, called Frame It Today, where we can take your art, customize it, and get it ready to hang on the wall. Here at River Ridge Hardware, 2803 West Garland.
Thanks for watching. Ask the host a question, recommend a guest, or check out any of our other programs on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SpokaneTalksMedia.com. Sponsored by River Ridge Hardware.